Hey everyone, Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to episode 8 of The Dark Side of RFK Jr. We've been reading Jerry Oppenheimer's book, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Dark Side of the Dream, published 10 years ago now by St. Martin's Press. And it's a very, very interesting read. Before we dive in, speaking of interesting, RFK Jr.'s confirmation hearings are now underway. Today, he was before the Senate Finance Committee for the first of 2 hearings. Tomorrow, he will return for yet another grilling in front of the Help Committee, which is actually, interestingly enough, a committee that his Uncle Teddy used to be the chair of for many, many years. So that is going to be fascinating. But, if you want to watch the hearings, I suggest that you do if you haven't already. I don't want to spend a lot of time here when we could be reading this great book talking about what happened at the hearings today. You can go watch those on C-SPAN's website or here on YouTube anywhere. And what really struck me as interesting in the last 24 hours was the day before yesterday, his cousin Caroline, the last surviving child of President Kennedy, released a letter that she had written to the Senate asking the senators not to confirm her cousin RFK Jr., very strongly opposing his nomination to this important position. And I found that just remarkable. As a Kennedy historian, I've seen many, many spats inside this famous family, but never anything like this. And, Caroline and Bobby have always had a pretty good but distant relationship. It's well known that Jacqueline Kennedy really tried to keep her children away from Ethel and RFK and all the kids and all the goings on and the craziness over at Hickory Hill. She did try to make sure that her kids didn't hang out with the RFK kids much because she thought they were a bad influence. And it is interesting to note that Caroline Kennedy never really speaks about anything too political. She's been ambassador now twice. She was President Obama's ambassador to Japan, President Biden's ambassador to Australia. She just recently left that post with the change in administrations. And people ask, well, why did she hold her tongue so long? Why didn't she say something while Bobby was running for president? She literally could not. When you're an ambassador, you are forbidden from commenting on any kind of political affairs, domestic affairs. So her job post literally prevented her from saying anything. And I think she was kind of biting her tongue until it bled. And finally, she just couldn't take it anymore and had to let her feelings be known to every senator in the United States Senate. And that she did. So I could just read you her letter. It's a very powerful letter. And I think you should read it in its entirety. But rather than me reading it to you, there's actually a video. Caroline read her letter on video. And I think it's better if you see this so that you can look her in the eyes, assess whether or not you think she's telling the truth, watch her facial expressions, and I'll let you come to your own conclusions.
Dear Senators, throughout the past year, people have asked for my thoughts about my cousin Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his presidential campaign. I did not comment, not only because I was serving in a government position as United States Ambassador to Australia, but because I have never wanted to speak publicly about my family members and their challenges. We are a close generation of 28 cousins who have been through a lot together. We know how hard it's been, and we are always there for each other. But now that Bobby has been nominated by President Trump to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, a position that would put him in charge of the health of the American people, I feel an obligation to speak out. Overseeing the FDA, the NIH, the CDC, and Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, agencies that are charged with protecting the most vulnerable among us, is an enormous responsibility and one that Bobby is unqualified to fill. He lacks any relevant government, financial, management, or medical experience, His views on vaccines are dangerous and willfully misinformed. These facts alone should be disqualifying. But he has personal qualities related to this job, which for me pose even greater concern. I've known Bobby my whole life. We grew up together. It's no surprise that he keeps birds of prey as pets, because Bobby himself is a predator. He's always been charismatic, able to attract others through the strength of his personality, his willingness to take risks and break the rules. I watch his younger brothers and cousins follow him down the path of drug addiction. His basement, his garage, his dorm room were always the center of the action, where drugs were available, and he enjoyed showing off how he put baby chickens and mice in a blender to feed to his hawks. It was often a perverse scene of despair and violence. That was a long time ago, and people can change. Through his own strength and the many second chances he was given by people who felt sorry for the boy who lost his father, Bobby was able to pull himself out of illness and disease. I admire the discipline that took and the continuing commitment it requires. But siblings and cousins who Bobby encouraged down the path of substance abuse suffered addiction, illness, and death, while Bobby has gone on to misrepresent, lie, and cheat his way through life. Today, while he may encourage a younger generation to attend AA meetings, Bobby is addicted to attention and power. Bobby preys on the desperation of parents of sick children, vaccinating his own kids while building a following hypocritically discouraging other parents from vaccinating theirs. Even before he fills this job, his constant denigration of our healthcare system and the conspiratorial half-truths he's told about vaccines, including in connection with Samoa's deadly 2019 outbreak of measles, have cost lives. And now we know that Bobby's crusade against vaccination has benefited him in other ways too. His ethics report makes clear that he will keep his financial stake in a lawsuit against an HPV vaccine. In other words, Bobby is willing to profit and enrich himself by denying access to a vaccine that can prevent almost all forms of cervical cancer and has already been safely administered to millions of boys and girls. During my time in Australia, I worked on the Quad Cancer Initiative, and I learned that cervical cancer is among the top 3 forms of cancer among women in a majority of countries. Tragically, every year, more than 200,000 children lose their mothers. They are orphaned due to a lack of vaccines and screening. Those are the real-world consequences of Bobby's irresponsible beliefs. We are a close family, and none of that is easy to say. It also wasn't easy to remain silent last year when Bobby expropriated my father's image and distorted President Kennedy's legacy to advance his own failed presidential campaign, and then groveled to Donald Trump for a job. Bobby continues to grandstand off my father's assassination and that of his own father. It's incomprehensible to me that someone who is willing to exploit their own painful family tragedies for publicity would be put in charge of America's life and death situations. Unlike Bobby, I try not to speak for my father, but I am certain that he and my Uncle Bobby, who gave their lives in public service to our country, and my Uncle Teddy, who devoted his long Senate career to the cause of improving health care, would be disgusted. The American healthcare system, for all its flaws, is the envy of the world. Its doctors and nurses, researchers, scientists, and caregivers are the most dedicated people I know. Every day they give their lives to heal and save others. They deserve a knowledgeable leader who is committed to evidence and excellence. They deserve a secretary committed to advancing cutting-edge medicine to save lives, not to rejecting the advances we have already made. They deserve a stable, moral, and ethical person at the helm of this crucial agency. They deserve better than Bobby Kennedy, and so do the rest of us. I urge the Senate to reject his nomination. Sincerely, Caroline Kennedy.
So it's kind of interesting the way this worked out, because we left off right at the start of chapter 18 in our last episode, episode 7. And what do you know? Chapter 18 actually talks quite a bit about Caroline Kennedy, her relationship with young Bobby, and we're going to pick up the story around 1978. And if you're following along in the hardcover, reading along with me, in the hardcover edition, we're going to dive in on page 185 today. And here we go. Chapter 18, A British Affair. If Valerie Duff Pacifico was both livid and saddened to learn from a tabloid gossip column that she had lost Bobby to another woman, his new love across the pond, 20-year-old model wannabe Rebecca Fraser, was both enjoying and cringing at Fleet Street's sensational coverage of the Kennedy scions' relationship with her. Virtually every day there were gossip items about them, with such blaring headlines as Bobby Jr. settles down with Becky and Worry for Bohemian Bobby. For Rebecca Fraser, exposure of her relationship with Bobby was a double whammy, because her own famous family had more than enough scandal with which to contend. Her mother, the glamorous author Lady Antonia Fraser, once dubbed the Golden Lioness of London's literary scene, had her own headline-making affair when, in 1975, she left her husband, the conservative Sir Hugh Fraser, for the married playwright Harold Pinter, whom she later married. The Kennedys and the Frasers had a long and storied history. Hugh Fraser had become friends with Jack Kennedy when he was in his early 20s, and his father was the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain in the late 1930s, and the Kennedy family was living in London. In 1975, 17-year-old Caroline Kennedy was a guest to the Frasers in their elegant home in London's Tony Camden Hill Square, while she was enrolled in an 11-month art studies course at Sotheby's. She was training to work in a gallery or an auction house, a job her mother then thought might be a good career choice for her. In late October of that year, just a month away from Caroline's 18th birthday and the 12th anniversary of her father's assassination, she barely escaped death when a bomb exploded under Hugh Fraser's red Jaguar, parked outside his home. Just before the blast, Fraser was about to drive Caroline in the bomb-rigged car to her studies at Sotheby's, but he fortunately stopped at the last minute to make a phone call. Some 6 months after the bombing, in the spring of 1977, Rebecca Fraser, who had been working at British Vogue as a fashion assistant with hopes of a modeling career, arrived in New York for a holiday and was invited to stay with Caroline's mother in her Fifth Avenue apartment. For a brief time, she worked as a hat check girl at a trendy restaurant and bar called One Fifth Avenue, which catered to a chic crowd that included a young British fashion editor by the name of Anna Wintour, then working at Viva, a sister publication to Penthouse. Mrs. Onassis thought Fraser was gorgeous and began to mentor her for a modeling career in America. Jackie arranged for Rebecca Fraser to meet the famed fashion photographer Francisco Scavullo, who was knocked out by her look. Jackie also put Fraser together with the powerful modeling agency head Eileen Ford, who then told People magazine that Rebecca Fraser was a modern-day Mary Pickford, a delicate, cameo-like creature. The Celebrity Weekly did a major story on Fraser under the headline, "Move Over Margot. It's Rebecca Fraser parlaying a literary name to modeling fame." The Margot reference was to Margot Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway's granddaughter, then a popular cover girl, who later died of a drug overdose. People described Rebecca Fraser as, quote, a sulky, silky, pre-Raphaelite beauty. Fraser told the magazine, "America's the land of opportunity. It's exciting and where I want to be." Anna Wintour at Viva, whose father, editor of the London Evening Standard, was a friend of Hugh Fraser's, put her on the cover of the magazine's June 1977 issue. Andy Warhol next jumped on the Fraser bandwagon and made her the View Girl in his artsy magazine Interview. It called her the essence of British upper-class soul. Despite all the attention, Fraser had been in New York without working papers and on a short-stay visitor's visa. Forced to return to London, she told a reporter, "I hope to come back and steal jobs from the Americans. I just want to make a lot of money. I want to enjoy this nice, free age where no one really minds what anyone does anymore." It was on her return home that she and Bobby were introduced by Caroline, his cousin and her friend, and the two young people began a romance in the fall of 1977. Bobby was knocked out by her erotic looks, the frilly white dresses with black cotton stockings that she often wore. Their relationship triggered a constant stream of Fleet Street tabloid reports, not all positive. There were gossip items, for instance, that Bobby was having health problems. Because of the stern British libel laws, the issue of Bobby's health was believed to be a veiled reference to his use of drugs while living in London at a time when heroin was readily available. One news account, under the headline "Worry for Bohemian Bobby," described him as being very thin and noted that he had been ill for some weeks now. The exact nature of his malady is not clear, it said. The writer of the story in the tabloid Daily Express had arranged to meet with Bobby for an interview, but Bobby broke the appointment by phone. It was very difficult to make any sense of what he was saying, the reporter noted. He is a charming and serious young man, but his bohemian mode of life must now be a source of worry to his mother, Ethel Kennedy. Bobby, he added, seemed destined for a career in politics, but that does not seem very likely at the moment. The story also quoted an unnamed friend saying, "He has gone through a bad time just lately." It then surfaced that a group of young women, dubbed the Bobby Sitters, had, because of his health, been keeping a vigil at his flat. Bobby reportedly was living there with Rebecca Fraser while he was supposedly studying for a research degree in, appropriately enough, international relations at the London School of Economics. Bobby vehemently denied the love nest story. "Jesus," he told a reporter, chewing on a plug of tobacco, a habit he'd picked up in Alabama, "I have a girlfriend back in the States. Romance? Me and Rebecca living together? It's not true." Wearing a beat-up windbreaker and raggedy jeans, he declared, "Take it from me, it's all a load of bullshit. Of course, I know Rebecca and her sister. They're great girls. My uncle, the late President Kennedy, was very close to Rebecca's father, and our families are great friends. But that's all there is to it." He emphasized his point by spitting a stream of tobacco juice. When asked the identity of his girlfriend in New York, he refused to tell. The Daily Mail account noted that Bobby seemed concerned at the prospect of his romance with Rebecca Fraser being reported back home. "Do you think they'd do that?" he asked anxiously. Then he answered his own question. "Yes, I suppose they will." And they did. That story, dated March 1st, 1978, was subsequently picked up in New York, and it was from that story that Valerie Duff Pacifico learned that Bobby was cheating on her. As it turned out, Bobby's matriculation at the London School of Economics was very brief, less than a month, and was described as a half-hearted attempt at advanced study. His cousin, Chris Lawford, viewed Bobby's decision to study at LSE's Strategic Studies Institute as a way to, quote, cement another brick in his path to becoming the heir apparent. Bobby had gone there on the advice of Lem Billings because both JFK and his brother Joe Jr. had spent some time there in the 1930s. Following in Bobby's wake, Lawford also showed up in London, where he said he had, quote, nothing to do but watch Bobby try to go to school, and 2, attempt to get drugs out of British doctors, who were way more hip to my game than their American counterparts. According to Peter Collier and David Horowitz, Bobby, while in London, commuted to the Kennedy ancestral home in Ireland's County Wexford to do drugs. After his time in London, Bobby and Rebecca Fraser returned to the States together, and he took her to Alabama to introduce her to the people he'd met while working on his thesis. There, Bobby had a curious accident. He and Fraser were sitting on a pier when he fell into shallow water, a few inches at most, and suffered neck and back pains and was hospitalized at the Mobile Infirmary in good condition. The next day, the New York Times reported that he had dived off the pier. There was no mention of his companion, Rebecca Fraser. In London, a follow-up report claimed that Bobby and Fraser had driven non-stop from Massachusetts all the way to Mobile, Alabama, arriving at 3 o'clock in the morning, and had been sitting on the pier watching the sunrise when the accident happened. As the Daily Express writer observed, goodness knows what was going through languid, tobacco-chewing Bobby's mind, for without testing the depth of the water, he suddenly plunged into the sea. Soon there were stories that Bobby intended to marry Rebecca Fraser with the support of her elderly maternal grandfather, Lord Longford, who had earned the nickname Lord Porn. In 1972, he had published a report denouncing pornography, saying it was bad for an ever more permissive society. But his obituary noted that he was a prurient reactionary and a shameless hypocrite touring the sex clubs that he wanted to close down. By the summer of 1979, the marriage rumors had reached New York. The New York Post ran the first photo of Bobby and Rebecca together in the Big Apple and claimed that the couple had been living in sin for 2 years. But a furious Rebecca denounced the rumors. "Our relationship will not lead to the aisle," she declared. "We are not going to get married. It's true we are together, but you know as well as I do that though people may spend all their lives in each other's company, they don't necessarily get married." At the August 1979 RFK Pro Celebrity Tennis Tournament, Bobby and Rebecca Fraser were tailed by a reporter and the photographer Ron Galella, who had made a career and a fortune photographing Bobby's Aunt Jackie. Asked about his relationship with Fraser and talk of marriage, Bobby said, "It would serve no purpose to talk about it. I have never spoken about it, and I don't intend to now." Galella photographed Bobby and Fraser at the tournament's reception in the Rainbow Room at Rockefeller Center. Bobby looked respectable in a suit and tie, his shirt open at the collar. Rebecca, looking hippie-like in a long gypsy-style dress, was on crutches after a freak accident when workout weights reportedly fell on her foot. While Ethel Kennedy and Lem Billings didn't think that Valerie Duff Pacifico was right for Bobby because she didn't come from money or have an aristocratic background, they and other members of the clan adored Rebecca Fraser, who had the right profile. When the two young lovers paid visits to the family's compound in Hyannisport, they were warmly welcomed, and the two reportedly shared a ski lodge during the RFK family's annual Christmas vacation in Aspen. When Bobby's sister Courtney married the network sports executive Jeff Rue, Bobby and Fraser were among the celebrants at the Georgetown Club in Washington. By the spring of 1979, Bobby had begun his law school studies at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. In the tiny community of Ivy, not far from the campus, he had rented a nondescript 4-room house, 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a kitchen. And in Alabama, he had bought a big old used car that was thought to have once been a police cruiser. Before long, it was filled with all of his junk and covered with his dog's hair. As a close pal of Bobby's observed years later, Bobby back then wasn't one for material things. He never spent a lot of money on clothes, and he wasn't the cleanest guy in the world. He never decorated the house. He was kind of a minimalist. By then, Rebecca Fraser, still seeing Bobby, had taken a job in New York as a researcher for the author Edward J. Epstein, a Kennedy expert who had previously written books about the Warren Commission and about JFK's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. Epstein had hired her, he recalled, on the recommendation of the London journalist and author Andrew Cockburn. Epstein later credited Rebecca Fraser for her research work on his book about diamonds and another about the KGB and the CIA. He recalled many years later that when she came to work for him, she was still involved with Bobby. And, as he recollected, she was engaged to him, if I remember. There was a relationship, but she never discussed it. When Epstein threw a going-away party for Rebecca Fraser on his terrace after she had worked for him for about 2 years and told him she was returning to London, he said the guests who showed up included Bobby, Caroline Kennedy, and her brother, John Kennedy Jr. According to the London gossip columnist William Hickey, a pseudonym, Fraser flew down to Charlottesville from New York on weekends to spend time with Bobby in his shabby, red-brick, distinctly un-Kennedy-ish home among the cherry blossoms. He wrote, Bobby's golden setter Hogan lounges outside, while indoors, the shy, attractive Rebecca, wearing a red sweater with jeans, rattles the dishes in the kitchen. Most weekends, the couple go bareback horseback riding in the shadow of the mountains. Their friend tells me it's the most unselfish love I've ever seen. According to the close friend, who was also studying law at UVA, the house in question was the one Bobby was renting in Ivy. Rebecca was living with Bobby in that house, he said. I had no idea of Rebecca's background, and I was surprised to later hear that she was from the British upper crust, and she didn't strike me that way. She was nice and smart and funny and a little ditzy. They got along well, they liked each other, but did Bobby philander on her? I'm sure he did. Around the same time, the New York Daily News reported that the couple had asked her estranged parents for permission to marry, and that they had agreed. In London, another newspaper observed, without elaborating, that if the couple was to wed, quote, there are various unpleasant habits the young Kennedy will have to be cured of. It was believed to be another veiled reference to Bobby's use of drugs. At the time the report appeared, Rebecca's mother, through her secretary, stated, I have just spoken to Rebecca in America, and she is furious about the stories. She says there is a romance, but there is absolutely no truth in the wedding plans. Rebecca and Bobby have never talked about setting a day. By the fall of 1981, 24-year-old Rebecca Fraser had returned permanently to London. Her relationship and American adventure with Bobby, one that lasted as long as 2 or 3 years, although she claimed it was just 1 year, was finally over. When the end came, there was a report in October 1981, attributed to Kennedy insiders, that the London Golden Girl had not exhibited the proper reticence when the paparazzi started flashing their light bulbs. They say Rebecca actually enjoyed being snapped. Back in England, Rebecca Fraser gave up her youthful modeling, got serious, and, following in her mother's literary footsteps, penned a well-received biography of Charlotte Brontë, followed by a popular history of Great Britain and several other books. She also married a prominent barrister and became the mother of 3 daughters. In 2014, looking back to her time with Bobby, Rebecca Fraser observed that she was going through a short-lived phase of the sort of idiotic behavior for which young people in their early 20s can do. It made great copy, she laughed. She remembered Bobby as great fun, very witty and amusing, and highly intelligent. She acknowledged that at the end of their relationship, she had visited him a few times in Charlottesville. She said, our relationship was petering out. In fact, during that period, he was also going out with Emily Black, unbeknownst to me. Emily, the new woman in Bobby's life, was a law school classmate, and they were falling in love. Her life would be turned upside down. Chapter 19, Bloomington Love. Emily Ruth Black had become romantically involved with Bobby during her second year in Charlottesville, 1979-1980, when Bobby was still seeing Rebecca Fraser. But no one saw the Kennedy-Black relationship becoming serious enough to one day involve marriage. They just seemed like good friends, and there were always plenty of women around Bobby, said a law school classmate. To that person and others, Emily seemed just one of a number of young ladies who was attracted to Bobby back then, many simply because he was a Kennedy who had inherited the charm and charisma of his male forebears, but with his own curious edginess, which acted like a magnet on some women. Innocent Emily Black from Bloomington, Indiana, was one. While both Bobby and Black were in class starting in September 1978, he'd also spent time in London and New York with Rebecca Fraser, and then on his Uncle Ted's failed presidential run. So, as a friend observed many years later, it was hard to tell where Emily stood with Bobby because he was in and out of Charlottesville a lot. 6'2" Bobby had met petite 5'4" Emily Black for the first time at Lord Hardwick's, a Charlottesville bar and pizza place popular with UVA undergraduates and law school students. He had gone there for a night of drinking with a new friend, a Yale graduate who had joined Bobby's class and roomed with him for a short time in the little house Bobby had rented. Bobby and I met Emily the same night, recalled the pal, who would remain lifelong friends with both. We went over to Hardwick's and had drinks, and Emily was sitting there, and Bobby just went over and sat down with her. In terms of women, Charlottesville had a less glamorous crowd, but Emily was attractive and very bright. Because she was kind of quiet, she was a change for Bobby, and he liked that. She was different from Rebecca Fraser. Was it love at first sight? I don't know about that, but Bobby and Emily got along and had fun. Just as the college-educated Valerie Duff Pacifico was much different from Bobby's first serious girlfriend, the Cape Cod teenager, Kim Kelly, and just as the London socialite, Rebecca Fraser, was a world apart from Staten Island's Pacifico, Emily Black had come from an entirely different place in terms of demographics. Hers was the modest Midwest. She was the Hoosier daughter of a schoolteacher mother, Elizabeth, known as Libby, and a lumber yard manager father. It was a family-owned lumber yard, but Thomas Allen Black was on the less successful side of the family tree, who suddenly died of a heart attack at age 34 when Emily was just 2. In order to support Emily and her 2 siblings, Sarah and Tom, Mrs. Black returned to Indiana University to earn a master's degree and then taught kindergarten and first grade in Bloomington. Unlike studious and academic Emily, her brother, young Tom Black, graduated high school and then spent 2 years in the Navy. He worked most of his life at Bloomington Hospital and was a bachelor. In high school, his friends called him Old Tom because, as one recalled, he was kind of crusty, a little profane, not very subtle, and plain-spoken. He had inherited the family's big old Chrysler 300, named it Daisy Bell, and he and his friends cruised the Hoosier National Forest outside Bloomington, and as one remembered, drank beer and smoked dope, the usual. Emily, meanwhile, went on to study at her mother's alma mater, Indiana University, where in 1978 she earned a Phi Beta Kappa key, majoring in political science. Until she began law school at the University of Virginia in the graduating class of 1981, she had spent her whole life in and around Bloomington, the increasingly depressed factory and fairly liberal college town where the first Kennedy in recent memory to go through was RFK, campaigning in the Indiana primary for the presidency in 1968. In the crowd that had turned out to see the popular RFK, Emily Black never could have imagined in a million years that one day she would marry his namesake. To her friends, it seemed like a Cinderella story come true. To others, she was more like Little Red Riding Hood meeting the big bad wolf. In high school, Emily was quiet, pretty shy, One of the smart kids who was definitely not in the in crowd, didn't run with the popular kids, wasn't in any of the cliques, didn't have many friends. Her closest was the pretty daughter of an Iranian college professor at Indiana University who died when she was young, just like Emily's father. And she wasn't real open or outgoing, recalled Dan Honeycutt, one of the few boys she dated when she was a senior at Bloomington North High, and he was a sophomore studying at the university, a bright math and physics major. He later taught school for a time after graduating from Indiana and had a successful career specializing in inertia navigation and ship stabilization for Sperry Marine. I was surprised that Emily studied law and became a lawyer, he observed many years later, because in high school she was not very assertive. Unlike the quiet, reserved Emily, Honeycutt, who was a friend of her brother Tom in high school, had hair past his shoulders and got along with all the different types, the jocks and the rednecks. But he also dated academic Emily Black. We went out. I took her to see Jesus Christ Superstar, and like everybody in that era, we went there stoned. It was the norm, he said. Emily smoked dope, but she wasn't a pothead. I smoked pot with her wherever we were, but she was not hanging out with that clique that was called the Heads. She was not one of us, if I can consider myself back then one of the Heads. After dating her for a time, he concluded that she was a hard person to get to know, a hard person to get to open up and talk. I tried, but it didn't work for me, but I thought she was cute and sweet. After graduating from Indiana, Dan Honeycutt immediately left Bloomington, which he later characterized as kind of a Mayberry in a bigger city, a reference to the fictional hick town made popular on TV's Golden Age Andy Griffith Show and Mayberry RFD. The university town became depressed as companies that offered locals the well-paying jobs, manufacturing behemoths such as RCA, GE, and Otis Elevator, either shut down or downsized. Bloomington, he said, was hard hit. The only way I could see surviving was to go to school. His career took him to Charlottesville, and it was there, after several years of not seeing or hearing from Emily while she was at Indiana University, that she called him out of the blue. Dan Honeycutt was wrong if he thought Emily Black had called him on her arrival in Charlottesville to rekindle whatever it was they'd had back in Bloomington when she was in high school. Because she knew he'd been a professional student for a time, her sole goal in touching base after several years was to pump him for information about the best way to go about getting financial aid packages to cover her tuition and expenses at UVA Law, and he was gracious enough to help. She had never talked to me about becoming a lawyer or going to law school, so I was very surprised when she got here and called me. It was out of left field, he said. We sat down and we looked at the financial aid applications and talked about various things she should check into that she'd probably qualify for. She was old enough to be separated from her parents, so her need was based on any income that she had, and back then the terms for a student loan were great. Back in Bloomington, Emily Black had worked one summer as a clerk in the law office of Guy Loftman, a one-time bearded, bespectacled, Karl Marx-style eyeglasses, member of the radical Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, who had won the presidency of Indiana University's student body in 1967 and 68 on a platform of student rights. Working for Loftman, she became friends with him, and he played a role in her decision to study law. Dan Honeycutt and Emily Black had gotten together a few times in Charlottesville, but after that, he never heard from or saw her again. That is, until he heard that she was seriously involved with Bobby Kennedy Jr. and was going to become a member of one of America's most famous political dynasties. When he learned that the petite redhead, whom he had occasionally dated and gotten high with on marijuana, was involved with Bobby, he recalled thinking, "What the heck? Something seems wrong with this picture. The Kennedys have this reputation of hardcore partying and drowning women, the whole Chappaquiddick thing. It struck me as really strange, because when I knew Emily, she was real sweet and quiet, reserved, so that seemed to be an odd matchup from the stereotype I had of the Kennedys. To think that she was hooked up with somebody who would do heroin was downright spooky. I could not imagine that Emily would marry Kennedy for the money. The words mercenary and Emily Black, they just don't go together. I had always viewed her as virginal and naive, so I thought. How did she get mixed up in something like that? Relatives back in Indiana wondered the same thing. As Janet Black, the widowed wife of one of Emily's deceased father's cousins, observed in early 2013, quote, "There were concerns because everyone knew Emily was a very sweet and innocent person to a certain extent, and everything we'd read about Bobby Jr. or about any of the Kennedys, of course, was just a different type of upbringing than what Emily had had. Emily was a regular person, and there were just so many stories going around about the Kennedys, that they were so privileged and so wild. It was wonderful they fell in love, but we were just concerned because Emily was such a sweet, dear girl, and we just didn't want to see anything ruin that sweetness." By the time Emily started seeing Bobby, she had become aware that he had a problem with drugs, one that would continue for some years. Emily and I were well aware of his drug use, and I saw it on a number of occasions. A close friend noted in October 2014, just weeks after he had attended Bobby's third wedding at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. The friend, who never used drugs, said that he had on occasion accompanied Bobby down to Harlem and saw him score heroin. That was Bobby from the beginning of when I knew him in law school, but you take what you get in a friend, and I understood that. At UVA, he said, it was pretty common knowledge that Bobby did drugs. This was the late 70s, early 80s, so it wasn't unusual that he did drugs, and I don't think people were shocked by it, but Bobby didn't want it to be publicized. Emily was aware, we were all aware, and everyone offered to help him whenever they could. There were times when Bobby tried to go cold turkey, the pal said, and he and Emily tried to help and support him. I spent weekends with him when he was getting off drugs, helping him with rehab, he disclosed. It was physically a little difficult. He had a lot of willpower, but the issue was that he had used drugs so much that it changed the physiology of his body. As I understood it, extended drug use suppressed certain glandular activity. He needed other actual drugs to restart stuff in his system. Our efforts were amateurish, to say the least. He'd stop, he'd go cold turkey. He just thought, I can beat this whenever I want. And he did for a while, but then it started again. You can have incredible willpower, but that doesn't mean you can turn addiction on and off. Despite his drug issues, Bobby had taken a break from his law school studies and from Emily to help out in his Uncle Ted's 1980 campaign for the presidency. The Massachusetts senator had long feared running for the nation's highest office after the assassinations of his brothers, expecting that he would be next to get a fatal bullet. But he felt that President Carter, hoping to be reelected to a second term, showed malaise about the future direction of the nation and reluctantly decided to throw his hat in the ring. It was a big mistake, and he would fail. Bobby was assigned to work for his uncle in the South because of his past experience there researching his Harvard thesis. He was given campaign marching orders to get Alabama voters in the Kennedy corner. But it wasn't all work. On the road, he reputedly cheated on Emily. The young journalists Peter Collier and David Horowitz, who had signed a contract to write a biography of the Kennedys, had convinced Bobby to permit them into his life. It was, as Bobby later rationalized, a disastrously wrong decision. Looking back in 2013, Horowitz revealed, quote, I told Bobby we were going to tell his story from his point of view and give him his voice, which we did. So there was a certain romance to him cooperating with us. But we had our point of view. Bobby said he would talk to me. He was looking for a journalist gun, his own biographer. He was told by Lem Billings he could be president one day, and that has an effect. Jack Kennedy surrounded himself with writers who were instrumental in his rise, so that could have been an aspect of Bobby's cooperation. He had a twisted mind. Noted Collier, quote, Bobby had a bit of an agenda with us. He wanted to be seen as the sort of real heir to Camelot. The RFK kids were very, very anxious about the fact that John, whom they saw as a foreigner, was seen as the heir to Camelot, and they felt that it was their father who had really made Camelot, in some sense, that he was really the author of the Kennedy myth, and that it was a savage miscarriage of justice that the children of Jackie, which is how they saw John and Caroline, should inherit this mantle, that it was rightfully theirs. With Bobby involved in Ted's campaign in Alabama, Horowitz took advantage of the situation and joined him, and was shocked by the scenes that he witnessed. On a 3-day swing with Bobby through Tuskegee, Birmingham, and Huntsville, recalled Horowitz, Bobby had a girl in every place. There were women like moths to the flame. I just know that he was fucking everything in sight, even though he was involved with Emily Black, who was just very quiet, just seemed like a nice person. By the end of the day, the rest of us were exhausted, and Bobby was ill, had the flu or something, and all of us collapsed, but there was a girl waiting for him. I was younger then, and I'm a healthy male, but I wouldn't have just wanted to go to bed with a strange woman. What is another fuck gonna do for you? It was just insanity, compulsive, nutty with him. Maybe in his mind he was building his heroic myth. He certainly couldn't have been getting a lot of pleasure when he was running in over 100-degree fever and really looked ill, and he was hoarse. He had one girl who was a campaign worker, so he always had that one. At one campaign event, he just went off to screw her. And, I'm going to stop right there because it's interesting. That story strikes me because now we're looking at, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. maybe being our next director of health and human services, and he will actually be, overseeing our response to infectious disease outbreaks, pandemics, epidemics. And yet he had so little care for these women, according to the story. While he had the flu, obviously, if you're going to have, kissing somebody else and having sexual contact, he was probably infecting each and every one of his partners with this flu bug. So just spreading the love, I guess, spreading it around. This is the guy we're going to put in charge of running our nation's infectious disease response? I don't know about that, folks. Anyway, back to the book. There was other bizarre and dangerous behavior that a shocked Horowitz witnessed with Bobby as the central figure. Late one night, driving back from Tuskegee, Bobby and Horowitz were in one of 2 cars filled with the Kennedy Scions campaign aides, mostly people he'd picked up along the way. They were on a 2-lane highway, going as fast as 80 miles an hour, and they were passing cigarettes between the cars. Just insanity. On another ride through Alabama, Horowitz recalled that the young driver of Bobby's car was consuming a 6 or a 12-pack of beer on a 2-lane road, and there was this hill in front of us, and we could not see over the hill, couldn't see the traffic coming, and the driver got into the opposing lane. That's the kind of things Bobby did, perfectly illegal and crazy, and he did them because he was used to people keeping silent, because nobody wants to be banished from the Kennedy magic circle and lose access. Horowitz and Collier made a pledge to Bobby that they wouldn't make mention of any drug use unless it became public, which it did while they were doing their reporting. It involved Bobby's arrest, stoned on a plane, for heroin possession. So things happened, and that opened up what we could talk about in the course of the book, said Horowitz. From a cousin of Lem Billings, they learned about him doing drugs with Bobby. When Lem Billings discovered that the cat was out of the bag, he blamed David Kennedy for telling the writers about the drug use. Billings had a real streak of cruelty and abuse in him, Horowitz later said. Here's the guy who's supposed to be the father figure, and he's doing heroin with these kids. Lem was doing heroin with Bobby and shooting delusions up his ass that he would be president one day. At that point, Bobby sent Peter Kaplan as an emissary to meet with Horowitz to keep the drug stories out of the book, to cut me off, revealed Horowitz. They met on a park bench in New York City, and Kaplan pleaded with Horowitz to close up everything, and by that time the book was pretty well written. Basically, his mission was for us to take everything about Lem Billings and drugs out of the book, which I was not going to do. Kaplan said to me, Bobby is going to run for Congress from Staten Island, or some shit like that, and he's going to be president one day. That's the way the Kennedys got everybody. Peter Kaplan was protecting the heir apparent. Kaplan was an intelligent fellow, but one who actually believed that some guy, Bobby, who would be busted for heroin and would be on the front pages all over the country, could be president one day. He was out of his mind, but that was the case. He was protecting Bobby's political career, as though he had one. Kaplan was just so inebriated, intoxicated by Bobby and the Kennedy name. How in the world could he imagine Bobby Kennedy running for office and winning? After getting to know about Bobby's dreams for the future and the way he thought, Collier, looking back, came to the realization that he thought that what we would do, what all the kept biographers of Kennedys do, which is suppress possibly damaging information and act as part of the party, part of the fantasy world with them. Bobby was shrewd in that he had picked up what the motifs were. Aside from walking on the wild side, one of the motifs was sensitivity to the role that literature plays in the building of a career and a life. He had large existential hungers, continued Collier. He was feeling those hungers in the way that kids do, but it was beyond that, because he was a Kennedy, and what kind of hungers do you feel as a Kennedy kid? It's not to be quarterback for Notre Dame, not to be head of the Chicago Mercantile Association. He wanted to climb Mount Kennedy, and what Bobby never realized was the incredible discipline it took for Jack to get to the top, for RFK to get where he got. Great discipline. He saw the indulgence, but he didn't see the discipline. He didn't want to see it because it conveys a daunting message. Horowitz had a number of interviews with David Kennedy, and as later reported in Collier and Horowitz's book, David claimed that it was Bobby who got him involved with drugs. And I'll stop again here because that corroborates exactly what Bobby's cousin Caroline said in her letter to the United States Senate yesterday, where she didn't mention David by name, but those of us who've been following the Kennedys for a long time, we knew who she was talking about. It wasn't just David. Obviously, in previous episodes of this podcast series, this book club, you know the names. Several of Bobby's friends, cousins, some of them died. David, his brother David, certainly Bobby led him down the road to ruin. Let's be honest. According to Collier, the Kennedys had begun spreading rumors after the book was published that the writers had done drugs with them, just to contaminate the book, to exonerate themselves for having cooperated. There was more than one effort to do that, even trying to hold us responsible for David's death. Because of Ted Kennedy's failing presidential campaign, Bobby returned to UVA to finish law school and continue his relationship with Emily Black. While Bobby was away, Emily had dated others whom she liked, but when he returned, she decided she liked him the best. As she later told People magazine, "We were in love, we wanted kids, and we were ready to limit our lives to each other." Still, they had very different personalities. Emily had a calm way about her, while Bobby was, as he himself acknowledged at the time, hyperactive. I have a tendency to stay out too late and drink too much beer. Bobby described Emily as perfect, and she thought of him as a lovable kind of slob. His drug use, of course, was kept secret. A woman Bobby had gone out with at the same time he was involved with Emily was Tess Dempsey, according to her mother, Connie Dempsey, who owned a prominent Charlottesville equestrian complex called Foxfield Stables, where Bobby kept his horses and a falcon during his time at UVA Law. Tess and Bobby dated a lot, claimed Dempsey. Bobby, she said, was a playboy. Like Joey Brody, who became a surrogate mother of sorts to the troubled Kennedy when he boarded with her in Cambridge while finishing his senior year at Palfrey Street School, Connie Dempsey had, she had asserted, taken on the same role in Charlottesville. Bobby considered me his mother, his Charlottesville mother, and he even told Ethel that he considered me his mother, recalled Dempsey many years later. Bobby practically lived at our house. We spent a lot of time together, he had dinner with us, and he was a real moocher, she said affectionately. But that wasn't a surprise, because the Kennedys were all known for being moochers. Bobby always paid his bills, but he didn't pay enthusiastically, she recalled. He'd pay by writing a check, and then he'd purposefully drop it somewhere, go off, and then somebody would have to hunt him down. Bobby's tight-fistedness was underscored when he got into a legal battle with Jody Ann Jacobson in the 50-50 ownership of a horse with a good Irish name, Killarney. A 24-year-old graduate student at UVA, Jacobson filed suit against Bobby and won an injunction against him from taking full possession of their jointly owned 5-year-old bay gelding. The tug-of-war over the horse, for which each had paid $1,250, that's $1,250, was sparked when Jacobson requested to buy out Bobby's half-interest per an agreement they had. Jacobson's attorney said at the time that Bobby had threatened to take the horse to New York. He told the Washington Post that she can't get Bobby to agree on a price. Even after these disputes arose, he continued to refer to the horse exclusively as his horse. Years later, no one could recall which of the parties kept Killarney. Bobby's interest in riding had been triggered by his mother, who had 3 consuming passions: the Kennedys, Catholicism, and horses. When she was a kid growing up in the Skakels estate in Greenwich, the walls of her bedroom were a montage of photos of her on horseback. As a student at Greenwich Academy, she owned not 1 but 2 horses, Smoky Joe and Beau Mischief. One of her pals, Billy Steinkraus, a member of the U.S. Olympic riding team, recalled, "She took to riding the way she took to touch football with the Kennedys. The first show horse she ever rode had been owned by Janet Lee Bouvier, years before Ethel had ever met her daughter, Ethel's sister-in-law, Jacqueline. Ethel rode everywhere, even through the front door of the Skakel mansion, and galloping like hell out the back door, shocking a friend who was an eyewitness to the event. When she was in college and scheduled to appear in a major horse show in Madison Square Garden, she was running late, and she took a shortcut across Central Park, risking arrest. The year before RFK was assassinated, Ethel Kennedy took several horses that she deemed had been mistreated and was charged with rustling, a hanging offense in Virginia, but she won the case. At times, Ethel came down from Hickory Hill to ride with Dempsey and her crowd. She was, Dempsey said, a better rider than her son, one of the best. For a time, Bobby had been a tenant on the farm owned by Jody Jacobson's family, according to Dempsey. He had also spent a lot of time in a home bought as an investment property by his law school classmate Sheldon Whitehouse, who was part of Bobby's small circle at UVA. Like Bobby, Whitehouse was the namesake of a prominent political father, Charles Sheldon Whitehouse, who had served in the Central Intelligence Agency, operating in Europe and the Far East, and later as the U.S. ambassador to Laos and Thailand near the end of the Vietnam War. In the 1980s, he served as an assistant secretary of defense in the Reagan administration. Whenever Bobby placed a telephone call to Connie Dempsey, he always prefaced his conversation by saying, "Hello, Connie, this is your favorite law student." But her half-joking, half-serious response was always, "You know that isn't true, Bobby. My favorite law student is Sheldon." Of the two, she had chosen the one who would be the most successful, at least politically. He was later elected U.S. Senator from Rhode Island with Bobby's support. And today, at Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s Senate confirmation hearing in front of the Finance Committee, he and his old pal from law school, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, met again, face to face. And it was a hell of a confrontation. Take a look at this.
Kennedy, I only have 5 minutes with you, and I've got a lot of experience with CMS, so you're just going to have to listen. Two things. One, if you want to move from advocacy to public responsibility, Americans are going to need to hear a clear and trustworthy recantation of what you have said on vaccinations, including a promise from you never to say vaccines aren't medically safe when they in fact are, and making indisputably clear that you support mandatory vaccinations against diseases where that will keep people safe. You're in that hole pretty deep. We've just had a measles case in Rhode Island, the first since 2013. And frankly, you frighten people.
There were a number of things about Bobby that rubbed Connie Dempsey the wrong way. He had built an outdoor cage on Dempsey's property to house his falcon, but he also chose to feed it disgusting roadkill that he stored in Dempsey's home refrigerator. She said, "We tried to encourage him to buy chickens for this purpose, but we weren't too successful." While he had taught the Dempseys and others in his UVA circle how to handle his bird, he had upset the horse-loving Dempsey when he began riding with the falcon on his arm, which she said upset the horse and made it crazy. Another issue for Dempsey was how Bobby treated his setter, Hogan, whom she noted he took places and dropped off, leaving it so people would have trouble finding it and expecting a reward for its return. He was not, she concluded, a very good dog owner. Bobby often brought Emily Black to Dempsey's stable for a ride, but as a wife and mother of 4, Dempsey didn't see a lot of romance between them. She said, "I thought it was mostly just a friendship thing, and mostly involved riding horses together. She was a pleasant person, quiet, meek, not confrontational. She married him, but all the girls were trying to marry him." Bobby and Emily Black were part of a law school crowd who rode horses and played together on property that belonged to a law professor in an area known as Liberty Hill. There was a pond. There, Bobby and Emily and some of his male classmates were known to go skinny dipping, and Bobby had a trick he liked to play on the guys. After they jumped in the water, Bobby would take their clothes and toss them up in a tree, said Dempsey, who had never forgotten the scene. Bobby thought it was funny as hell to see the naked guys climbing the tree, trying to capture their clothing to put on so they could ride down the highway to my stable. Dempsey had come to the conclusion that Bobby was more interested in partying than studying, and believed that he must have had a lot of help graduating because he wasn't the best student. He just didn't do his best. As an example, one of the classes the future lawyer was required to take involved participating in a mock trial. Bobby, along with Sheldon Whitehouse, acted as the defense for a student playing the role of a man accused of burglary or some similar crime. But 2 very sharp, very savvy female students in Bobby's class were the prosecutors. After all the testimony was given, the rest of the class, acting as the jury, voted to convict. Bobby and Whitehouse had lost their case, a foreshadowing of Kennedy's brief career in criminal law as a prosecutor. And I'm going to leave it there. We made it through chapters 18 and 19 today. And in the next episode, we'll start with chapter 20. It's interesting, isn't it? There's this pattern. We explored it in the previous episode, episode 7, which I called Bobby Sitters. It's been sort of an inside joke since he was a kid or since he was a teenager that, all of the RFKs were kind of raised by nannies and babysitters and volunteers, because RFK, even when he was alive, he wasn't around. He was busy. He was the attorney general, and then he was the senator from New York, and then he was a presidential candidate. Always busy, always traveling, always away from home. Ethel was not really a hands-on mother. It got worse after RFK's assassination. She was grieving and angry, and she just couldn't cope with raising these 11 unruly kids. So, she kind of passed them off to others. It's a pattern that you see throughout Bobby's life. It's, usually you outgrow your babysitters. By the time you reach maturity, grown men don't need babysitters. And yet, Bobby Kennedy has always had these Bobby sitters around, as they were called, whether it was Lem Billings or Peter Kaplan or the Brody family, or wives, girlfriends played that role. There were always secretaries, and like to this very day, you've got Stephanie Spear, who was his longtime friend and press secretary on his presidential campaign, and she's now coming with him as his, chief of staff at Health and Human Services, if he is confirmed by the Senate. So anyway, we will find out if he gets confirmed by the Senate. His next Senate hearing is tomorrow, Thursday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That will be before the HELP Committee, the committee that Ted Kennedy used to chair. Going to be very interesting. We'll see what comes up. I'll have updates for you in the next episode, and we'll dive into chapter 20. Please take a moment to like this video, share it if you enjoyed it, share it with a friend, share it with your senator before they vote, and let your feelings be known in the comments. Comment as you see fit. Once again, thanks for joining me. Take care. See you next time. I'm Lori Spencer.